Okay, so we're going to be talking about the compensation agreements today. You've probably seen there are two different compensations, so we thought we'd try and make sure that you're clear on how they're used. And there are also two modifications. These were released mid-June. We've had one session on them, but I think that there's been a little bit of confusion. And so we want to just kind of make sure that there's an understanding of when and where and how and why they're in both packages. Any things that we discuss here today, we are respectful of antitrust. So anything that we discuss here today are all related to the Legends of Real Estate. If anyone finds this video on our YouTube channel, please know that any of our discussions are related solely to the Legends of Real Estate. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Second. Okay. And let's go ahead and move a few of these things around. All right, so let's just start from the beginning on this. All right, can someone please just confirm that you can see my screen, which should be should not be all of us.
In the commercial world.
Excuse me. Okay, 1 second. So it popped off. All right. Work. Here. Share here. So hopefully you can see something that says compensation agreements. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah.
How about online? Can you guys see it where it says compensation agreements?
Yes.
Someone just come
Yes.
off. Okay, great. All right, just want to make sure it's projecting okay. So we do want to talk about the compensation agreements. We want to talk about how and when to use these agreements, why you're using these agreements. So let's just jump right in. And why do we need these compensation agreements?
Because the state says we have to.
The state doesn't say we have to have the compensation agreements. The state says we have to have the buyer agency agreements. The compensation agreements we want so that we can ensure that we get paid and that we know how we're getting paid and who's paying us. So that's what the real essence of the compensation agreements are. So let's talk about what the difference in the two agreements are. First, there's the seller's broker to buyer's broker compensation agreement. So that's the first one. And this is really that the seller is listed with another brokerage. They have an agreement to pay the listing brokerage a certain amount, and that amount will be potentially shared with the buyer's brokerage. This is very similar to what we're currently doing, where there's brokerage compensation established within MLS that shows what the compensation is. But in a case where you're using the agreements that's the seller's brokerage to the buyer's brokerage, the compensation is flowing through the seller's brokerage. In other words, the seller has agreed to pay the listing brokerage a total amount, and that total amount, a portion will be given to the buyer's brokerage, and a portion will remain with the listing brokerage. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but just because at the onset of a negotiation with the seller on the listing compensation, total compensation, if at the discussion of the total compensation when the listing brokerage is talking to the seller says, yes, I'll list with you, yes, I'll pay 6%, and yes, I understand that 3% of that is going to the buyer's brokerage. Just because that discussion occurs at the time of listing does not mean that that's the compensation for the buyer's brokerage that is set in stone. Remember, all compensation is negotiable. So if at the onset of the negotiation or during negotiation, compensation, just like any other term or condition, becomes an element of negotiation. So if the seller is not happy with other terms and conditions and would like to offset or change the compensation to the buyer's brokerage, even though the compensation is flowing through the listing brokerage, they can. That's why you have a modification to the seller's broker to buyer's brokerage compensation agreement.
Okay, so if it's on the onset, you say 6%, 3 and 3, and then something comes through as an offer, and then they want to adjust that,
Right.
that's when you do the modification?
Right. So you'll see, we're going to go through a scenario to
Okay.
try and figure out when you use the different
Okay.
agreements.
Okay,
But yes, if you're the listing broker and I call you and I say, is the seller willing to compensate? And you say, yes, the seller has established 3% compensation to the buyer's brokerage.
okay,
Then you have an obligation to make sure that when you send your offer over, that discussion is memorialized in some sort of a form. That form would be the seller's broker to buyer's brokerage compensation agreement.
okay,
All right. So you send it over at 3%, and that becomes now a term or condition of the contract, just like all other terms or conditions. So the seller then reviews the offer and says, well, I like X and I like Y, but I don't like Z.
okay,
So because I don't like Z, I'm going to go ahead and counter Z, but I'm also going to counter the compensation. They can do that.
okay,
The compensation. See, right now, the compensation, it's cooperation and compensation. And whatever compensation is offered in MLS is the compensation that the brokerage has established with the seller and has an obligation to pay to the buyer's brokerage.
okay,
Since it's going away and won't be in MLS anymore, the compensation that's discussed at the onset when you call to find out if the seller is offering compensation is what the seller has established that they would consider offering. It's really the best way to do it.
so essentially, because the MLS has it stated, and that's gonna go away, it has to be stated somewhere else, and that's what this is.
Correct.
And it has to accompany your offer.
Right.
Okay,
Right. So this seller's broker to buyer's broker compensation is your way to memorialize that the listing brokerage has said the seller has agreed to pay a certain amount through the brokerage. So the brokerage is collecting the money. It's you know, when you end up looking at the closing closure, it's credits and debits anyway. So, but the negotiation that's been set up is the seller will pay the listing brokerage and the listing brokerage will pay the buyer's brokerage in that case. But the seller still has the obligation or still has the opportunity to negotiate the compensation. Yes.
All right, let's do this scenario. I want to show your listing.
okay,
And so I call you, will the seller compensate?
okay.
And you say yes. Well, do I ask her to send me this before I show the property? I mean, when does this happen?
Okay, so you're exactly right. So that's that when you call to question whether or not the seller is compensating, you should request a compensation agreement from the listing agent. But remember, now we're talking about calling listing agents, who sometimes aren't very easy to get a hold of.
Yeah.
You're now talking about asking a listing agent to send you something. And this is why we put both the seller's broker and to buyer's broker and seller to buyer's broker in the packages, both listing and selling packages, because if they don't send it to you, you need to ensure that you have it with you to send to them in the offer. Or if you're doing exactly what you're talking about, as a listing broker, you're taking the forms and filling them out in memorializing what the seller's intent is. And again, it's their intention. You're memorializing the intent. You can then send that over because you'll have it signed by it. You'll just be missing pieces,
Right,
which
if
will be
I'm
filled in.
the listing
1
agent,
second, Tony.
if I'm the listing agent, would I be smart to fill this out with the seller's broker's name,
Right.
but no buyer's broker
Correct.
and the property address,
Uh-huh.
and have this ready to email out to
That's
anybody?
Exactly what we're recommending.
Okay,
Correct. That's why it's in the listing package. One second, Tony, and then Linda, and then Teresa. Tony,
Okay.
go ahead.
Just real quick, we're not allowed to upload this into the document section on the MLS.
No.
Correct? Because I know it
No.
can't be in the description, so I'm just double checking. Okay,
You're correct. It cannot be. Thank you for making sure that that's clear. It cannot be in MLS. It cannot be stated in MLS. It cannot be, no words using compensation may be in the private remarks.
And it can't be in showing time either.
There's no place for it and it can't.
So even like when you upload documents such as the seller's disclosure, this can't be in your
Cannot
docs
be in
file
there.
because it would
No.
be in MLS and that's enough.
Correct. Linda.
I'm sorry.
I'm a little confused as to why there is no place for the seller to sign acknowledging that this is true and his instruction to you.
And the reason that is, my understanding, the way it's been explained to me is that,
Listing
Because-
agreement.
well,
It's in the listing agreement.
if it's on the seller's broker to buyer's broker, it could potentially be on the listing agreement. The other part is that there's supposed to be a negotiation between the seller and the buyer. So this is sending to the
Appreciate it.
buyer's brokerage the intent of the seller. The seller doesn't have to sign it because it's their intent. It can still be negotiated between the buyer and the seller.
Okay.
That's the way
Can we put approximate in here?
that little
To
symbol for approximate.
CYA? I do.
Yeah, you can. I mean, right now you can put anything you want in there. All right, so
Hey, Clark, it's
the,
it's
yes.
Leslie. So
Hey.
it's good morning. So it sounds like the seller can also change his or her mind on what they're going to compensate to the listing agent.
No, that will be memorialized in the listing agreement. So in order for the seller to change the compensation to the listing brokerage after executing the listing agreement, the brokerage would have to agree to any adjustment, just like now. If right now the seller is agreeing to a total compensation, let's say 6%, and if we change that, it has to be done in a modification to the listing agreement that the brokerage agrees to. So even then, even after August 17th, if the seller and the listing brokerage elect to change compensation, then that would have to be memorialized in a modification to the listing agreement executed by the brokerage.
Okay.
The compensation to the buyer's brokerage, whether it comes from the listing brokerage or the seller, is supposed to be transparent and is supposed to be negotiable at any point.
Okay.
Okay. So if your question is, can a seller negotiate a listing brokerage compensation? Of course they can. It's just whether the listing brokerage will negotiate that compensation.
Okay.
All right, the seller to the buyer's broker agreement. This is the buyer's brokerage is negotiating directly with the seller. So this would be if the listing agent,
This is not listed property.
it could be a for sale by owner. It's if the listing agent has indicated the seller is not offering any compensation.
Oh, okay.
So now the seller is negotiating directly with, or excuse me, the buyer's brokerage is the buyer is negotiating directly with the seller through the buyer's brokerage.
Thank you so much.
So this is the sellers to the buyer's brokerage. Okay, go ahead.
No, run that by me again, please.
Sure.
Why wouldn't this go through the seller's broker?
So if the seller has said to the listing brokerage, the seller's brokerage, that they are not offering any compensation.
Okay,
So now I call you and I say, I want to show your property. Is the seller offering compensation? You say, no, I'm sorry, the seller's not offering compensation. I say, okay, great. So now any negotiation is directly to the seller in the negotiation of the contract. So if there's no compensation, or if it were for sale by owner.
So does this part of an addendum to the contract?
Yes, just like the other one would be too when you send it.
Okay. But you wouldn't present this before you showed the property, so you'd be showing the property with no seller compensation in it at that time. It's just what
At the
buyer
time
will
of-
pay you.
Well, or if this has been, if the seller has said to the listing brokerage, I'm not paying anything, and the listing agent has executed one of these and sent it over to you in zero, that way would be your affirmation that they are not paying anything. Then you create the offer at the time of the showing. If you would like to share with your buyer, the buyer has requested to understand what compensation is being offered by the seller, then you would execute a seller to buyer's brokerage compensation agreement at the time you write the offer with the compensation that the buyer is requesting from the seller.
Okay, but what if the seller doesn't sign it?
Seller doesn't have to sign it. Seller can negotiate it. Seller can say, I'm going to continue to pay zero. And then it would be the responsibility of the buyer who's executed the buyer's brokerage agreement.
And so if the buyer wants the house, that's why the buyer's brokerage agreement would come into play, is because if they want the house, they have to pay us.
So, and that's the thing that everybody keeps saying, if a buyer doesn't want to see a house because the seller's not offering anything, even though they've executed a buyer's brokerage agreement, that's why we're having the complaint right now at the Florida Real Estate Commission, that a buyer's brokerage is steering a buyer away from a property.
Understandable.
So but the buyer is the one who said, look, if they're not paying compensation, I don't want to see the house because I don't want to pay the full compensation that I've agreed to pay you.
So the seller is suing the buyer's agent?
It's filed a complaint. It's not an
Filed a
actual
complaint,
suit.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's going through the Florida Real Estate Commission as a complaint of one brokerage against another related to steering.
So that seller in essence is trying to penalize an agent for bringing a buyer to their property and they wouldn't pay him, and so they're not gonna show up.
He's trying, the seller is trying to penalize the buyer's brokerage for not bringing the buyer
Yes,
to the property.
because he wouldn't pay them.
Because he wouldn't pay them when the buyer has already executed a buyer's brokerage agreement. So therefore, did the buyer have ill will in establishing the buyer's brokerage agreement with no intent to pay? In other words, with no intent to uphold the contract of
Yeah.
compensation.
Well, what if that buyer has not agreed to pay their agent anything and said, only show me those properties where you will be compensated by the seller?
Right.
Then they would be within their rights to not show properties where. no
Correct.
compensation
So-
is.
In case you didn't hear the question is, what if there's a buyer's brokerage agreement that is executed at 0%? In other words, that the buyer has said, I am not paying a buyer's brokerage agreement, or I'm not paying a buyer's broker, and you've executed that with the buyer, understanding that you may not get paid, then what you're looking at is if the buyer says, do not show me anything that the seller does not offer compensation, that would be in paragraph, I think it's 13 of the buyer's brokerage agreement. In additional terms, buyer has requested to see no properties where seller does not offer compensation.
Okay, so that needs to be documented because.
Absolutely has to be in,
Yeah,
has to be in the
because it
buyer.
can't be verbalized and stand against any kind of.
No, it has
This
to be in the
reminds me
buyer.
of how we
brokerage agreement.
would do rental transactions in New York City. And when before you do a showing, right, you have your consultation, but then you have your list. And then you say, okay, if the landlord is paying the fee or not paying the fee. And I would always say, well, I'm gonna show you a selection, right? So you get to choose. And it's,
Even if they get to choose, it has to be in writing.
Yeah,
oh, yeah,
So
yeah.
you have to have it, I mean, if the buyer's intent, and this is where we're gonna get into contract law, which I'm not the expert on by any stretch of the imagination. But if a buyer has executed an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, and their intent, they've executed it with an amount to pay, and their intent is not to pay, they've falsely entered into a contract. So, I mean, I think we're gonna, we have to watch what the intent is of the buyer, and then what we put into the buyer brokerage agreement. So we have to be really careful
We
with
as
that.
Legends agents would not say, unless the customer says to us, I don't want you to show me any of those houses. Cause you might get paid for your services on them, or no, the opposite. It's,
Either way, if the buyer is indicating that they do not want you to show a house, you need to have them sign off on that. If it's not already covered in your buyer brokerage agreement, for example, if your buyer brokerage agreement doesn't state buyer is requested to see no homes that offer less than, or that no homes that offer zero, or no homes, that has to be in your buyer brokerage agreement.
Mhm.
And then if there's a change, if there's any alteration or iteration of that, especially at the onset of this, you guys, I know I'm probably being, you know, what is, I don't know.
Pollyanna?
No, I'm not being Pollyanna. I'm being the opposite of what whoever she is. Um, for some of Pollyanna, and not being all bright and serious, because right now I believe that there are testers that are already starting up there.
Oh, I'm sure.
So, I mean, I truly believe it just by calls we've gotten here at the office.
My phone has been
So-
blowing up and it's just how you interact and it's
Yeah.
like, I just, right now I'm blocking a lot of things and I don't even know if that's smart because I'm certain that the way that these text messages are worded, I can tell.
Yeah,
I
so
just can
the
tell.
point is if we're at least aware, and when we're overly cautious at the onset, then we'll be prepared with other changes that may come down the pipe. So,
Okay,
back to the seller to buyer's broker. So this would be when the listing agent is telling you that there's no compensation being offered. This would be if you're working with a for sale by owner. This would be if you're dealing directly with the seller in some way, shape, or form.
Okay.
For compensation.
And if this will not be constituted as going behind the sign. If this is a listed property and you're going to the seller for this,
As long as you submit it directly to the listing
to the
brokerage.
listing agent,
Right.
okay,
So this
Okay.
would accompany your offer,
okay,
just like the seller's broker to buyer's broker. So these are exactly like all the writers that we're now dealing with. That's exactly what these are. These are writers or addenda. They are attached to your offer, included with your offer.
so this is after you got your your buyer's agreement. This is when you're actually negotiating into a contract and this is added to that negotiation.
Correct. So this is what, and again, this is why we put them in the buyer's package and the seller's package, because we can't depend that the other side
Yeah.
is going to be
Okay.
providing the information. So you need to be prepared.
You can really depend on that.
Yes,
Will that be, but that would not be uploaded to MLS.
Right.
That would
Absolutely
be
not.
up to the buyer's agent to request it from the listing agent. Or
Yeah.
the listing agent is classy enough that they just forward it on.
well, so,
It's,
but this is why we put it in the listing package, because we believe that you should execute these at the time of listing. While they're both in the listing package, the reason we put them both in the listing package is if the seller has agreed to pay total compensation to us, the listing brokerage, versus pay solely to the listing brokerage and then negotiate directly with the buyer's brokerage. So that determines which form you would use when you're listing it. Everybody just went blank in the room. I'm probably thinking that maybe everybody online did too.
I think the scary part of this is right now, I could not sit down in front of a seller and explain how this is gonna work. I truly can't.
Well, what
Really can't.
if you didn't? What if you just sent it, like, do you have any listings that are active right now?
Yes.
Okay, so we could test out with my sellers. What if we just sent this to them? We've already said, okay, they're gonna pay you told me that for College Street, right? We need to get this signed already, because we need to.
I said,
anticipate.
what Maggie's talking about is I'm recommending that for those of us who are getting listings, that we start using these forms now so that when August 17th comes,
Yes.
they're not completely foreign. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
So
but-
I'm just going to send it to them and just say, hey, I sent you a form that needs to be filled out. Let me know if you have questions.
Well,
Sit
I
down in
mean,
front of my
I-
people.
For sure.
think-
Well, this is for an already signed listing agreement, right?
Well, but still, I think we all need to take a deep breath and step back and go, okay, it's a slightly different pace. So I don't think talking to your sellers, any of us talking to our sellers, it should be really any different. I mean, I think that we should be talking about what the market is. I think we should be talking about our value. I think we should be talking about what we do. And then, and remember, it won't be till later this week that we actually get the revised listing agreement. So we don't know how the revised listing agreement is going to showcase compensation. We anticipate that it will be focused on what the listing broker's compensation is, and then a secondary option for, do you want to, do you not want to? If you do want to work with the buyer's brokerage or compensate the buyer's brokerage, at what level do you want to? And then I'm imagining that the statement, all compensation is negotiable, will probably be added to that. So we don't know what that's going to look like now. But I think with all of our sellers, I think just talking to them about what we do and how we do it is going to be where we always want to start. I hate to say it, but most of your sellers will probably sign just about anything you put in front of them because they trust you so much. But is it important that they understand what they're signing? Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And this is exactly why some of the brokerages that are professing to be single agents have gotten away with some of the things that they have, is because they put something in front of a seller and don't explain it to them. So we don't want to do that.
Well, you bring up the point that that single agents have long not ever disclosed in our marketplace, either verbally or in writing. And until pressed, they don't disclose it.
Well, even in press, they don't.
I know, and I figure.
But
that
that's Florida
all of this-
statutes. Florida statutes
I
doesn't
know.
require them to. So
But I fear that.
Code of
some
Ethics
is
does,
going
but they
down-
choose not to
Yeah.
abide by that. Anyway,
Going down the same path.
yeah, well, yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
So, sorry,
Okay.
sidebar, back to buyer brokerage, or excuse me, compensation agreements. So there are the two. It's just going to be getting ourselves in line with which do we use, when do we use which, and do we ever use them together? And the answer is yes. So I thought I'd throw that out there for you. All right, so let's try something.
Oh,
So here's a little scenario. The buyer has signed an exclusive buyer broker agreement committing to work with you and compensate the buyer brokerage 3% of the purchase price at closing. Does everybody hate word problems? I know I do. Anyway, they would like to see a home located at 6485 Spring Tree Circle listed for $550,000. You call the agent with the listing brokerage and inquire if the seller has agreed to compensate a buyer's brokerage. The listing agent responds that the seller is offering 2.5% compensation. Okay. All right. So, what is the next step?
you need to tell your buyer that.
You need to get it in writing.
Okay.
Yeah, you
Gotta
get
see
it in
it.
writing from them.
Need to get it in writing.
Get the email.
Okay.
So I would ask the listing agent to send me this information. If they don't have it, send the seller's broker to buyer's broker filled out for them so they can sign at that moment.
Absolutely. So that's exactly it. We need to get this in writing.
So if the listing agent won't provide it, then we fill out one of these and sign it. And,
Execute it and put it with your offer.
okay,
So what Brett was saying is, I'll ask them for it. If they don't send it, I'm going to create one. And that's exactly right. So the next step after the conversation is to get it in writing. That's exactly what we need to do, is get it in writing. The question is, how's it being paid and who's paying it? It's obviously the seller. Is it being paid through the brokerage, or is it being paid directly to the buyer's brokerage? So usually, in most cases, it would be the seller broker to buyer brokerage. So you would request that from the listing agent. If you don't get that back, then you add the seller brokerage to buyer brokerage compensation agreement to your offer, filled out by you. If you do receive it back from the listing agent, you still include that seller brokerage to buyer brokerage compensation agreement with your offer. So always include the compensation with your offer.
So
Okay,
you can have both.
I'm just talking about the seller's broker to buyer's broker right now.
all right,
I
but
don't know.
what you would attach to your contract is the seller to buyer broker, right?
Depends on the conversation with the listing broker. So if in this case, they're paying 2.5%.
Okay,
So probably have to ask the question, is that compensation flowing through you or directly from the seller?
Wait,
well, they all
What
paid
should
out of
I
Go
be
through
too?
you.
Thought what?
Okay, I know what you're saying. So if like the seller tells you, hey, Clark, I'll pay you 6% to do this whole thing, right?
Right?
Then it's either up to you and your broker if you want to compensate the buyers.
No, it's never up to us. It's never up to us.
No,
It's always up to the seller.
yes.
So if the seller says, I'm going to pay you listing brokerage 6%. Now, that's my total pie. Now, when we get a buyer, I'd be willing to pay them 3%. That's all flowing through the listing brokerage. All of that. Is that 3% committed in stone? No. Seller can always negotiate that 3% at any point in time. So if there's that discussion, then great, then the money's flowing through. If I'm talking to a listing broker and the listing broker says, yes, the seller is considering paying 2.5%. I'm going to want to confirm that, is that coming through you or is that coming through the seller? If they say to me the seller is considering 2.5%, I would most likely execute the seller to buyer's brokerage agreement.
okay, but the reason I would not want to attach the seller broker to buyer broker to a contract to purchase is that the brokers aren't party to that contract. It's between the buyer and the seller, correct?
The contract is between the buyer and the seller, but if the seller has agreed to compensate the the listing brokerage entirely, and that it's the responsibility of the seller's brokerage to pay, then it would be that you would need the seller's broker to buyer's broker.
Okay.
So if it works, if it's supposed to, one second, please, if it's supposed to flow like it does now, it would be seller's broker to buyer's broker. Okay, I'm sorry, somebody online had a question?
It was Leslie. I was just gonna say, so just to make this more clear, than the mud that I'm seeing. Why wouldn't it just say on the seller's broker to buyer's broker form, why wouldn't it say that the seller will agree to pay up to X amount? Because I mean, to me, it seems like that's a waste of time. If you're just gonna say, okay, the seller will compensate 3%, and then you turn around, but the seller to buyer's broker, they say 2.5%, then they're gonna have to renegotiate that form. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, why wouldn't they just say the seller will
Absolutely.
consider paying up to X amount?
And the reason, my understanding of why that is because that it has to be a specific amount that the buyer and the seller can negotiate. So up to is 2 under for transparency purposes, and that the buyer and seller must understand what is being requested and what is being given. So that's
Right,
my
but
understanding of why
but if
you would
I'm
say
a-
up to.
Sorry. But
Go
if
ahead.
if I call the listing agent and they say, yes, I have the seller's broker to buyer's broker form filled out, and the seller is willing to pay, 3%, but he didn't sign it. Then when we go into negotiation, the buyer says, okay, well, I want the 3% because that's what, you and I signed over, or I signed with you. And then the seller can turn back around and say, well, no, I changed my mind. I'm not going to pay that 3%.
They can, absolutely.
Yeah, right. That's what I'm saying. Like, it seems silly not to just put that it's up to, because it's still negotiable.
Okay. I don't disagree that up to would probably be helpful. However, based on the way the settlement was designed and based on the intent of the settlement, it needs to be an actual amount that a buyer is requesting and an actual amount that the seller is considering.
Okay.
And then if that changes, that's why that modification form is there.
Okay.
And I understand what you're saying, up to, so that we all know it's negotiable. But then the buyer doesn't know what specifically the seller is paying, so they can determine what they would necessarily have to pay, or can they pay. So the numbers have to be a little more solid, is the way it's been explained.
Okay. Clear as mud.
Yeah. MJ, you had a question?
I did, and this kind of brings me, I talked to you last week about it, because I just went under contract with a house. And it was my first buyer broker agreement I did with the buyers. So we did the 3%, and then the seller is only paying the 2.5. So this is where, in fact, I had told the listing agent, which I haven't gotten it back, but I'm gonna go ahead and fill it out now after this conversation, for the seller's broker to buyer compensation, even though it's still in MLS at this time. We still need to fill that out, correct? It's just to make sure we are compensated, even though it's still in MLS.
Well, if it's in MLS, I think it's good practice to fill out the seller's broker to buyer's broker compensation.
Okay,
But in MLS, MLS is currently the guarantee of cooperation and compensation.
right.
So the guarantee of what is offered in MLS is what's guaranteed to be paid from the listing brokerage to the buyer's brokerage.
Okay, and that additional 0.5%, that would just be at the disbursement at the end when you close. Pay it, your
We'll talk
disbursement.
about,
That's
we'll talk about,
compensation. I don't want to.
we'll talk about
I don't want to get it confusing, so yeah, I'll get on that topic in another time. So, yeah, okay,
we'll talk about how to manage the difference in the compensation in a
okay,
minute.
okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Bonnie, your hand is still up. Do you have a question, Bonnie Seeker? Okay, I guess not.
Well, I think, can I say one thing? I think
Yeah.
it's good because I've worked with buyers who maybe weren't fully a part of all the negotiations that happened on the phone, right? And when we have the ability to work our commission into, what the offer is, right? Like, I think it's a good opportunity to work with our customers, right? Well, we've already had these conversations, right? We've already filled them out. We've established they're either going to pay if the seller doesn't pay or not, right? But as a buyer's agent, if we're submitting an offer, when we're submitting that offer, say we don't have this back yet, we don't have it guaranteed, it's not signed, right? Like, then do we have our customers have that conversation with our customers of, okay, this is your offer, right? And then as part of the offer, like, haven't heard back yet, but this is are you cool with this commission?
So you're going back to what we just said, and what the next question is, should you attach the agreement to the offer? Why or why not? So if you have not heard back from the agent, I think Brett expressed it well. If I don't hear back from the agent, I'm definitely going to put what they said to me in writing using either the seller's broker to buyer broker or the seller to buyer's broker agreement. If you haven't heard, if you call and you don't get a call back and you're ready to submit the offer, you should never hold up submitting the offer. You should always put the compensation agreement with your offer, always, always. So now that's a new rider that you're going to be including. That's why we've included it in both packages. You'll always include it with your offers. So to your point, is the buyer now more engaged in the conversation about compensation? Yes, they are. So should you attach the agreement? Why or why not? Yes, you should always attach the agreement, because this is the written form that will say what we've discussed. Now, just like an offer, what we've discussed is in writing, or what we're memorializing is in writing. However, every piece of an offer can be negotiated, and compensation is one of those pieces of an offer that can be negotiated at this point.
Which is the seller to buyer's broker form. If you want the seller to confirm their commitment. Correct?
You could, again, it's a matter of terminology. If you've spoken with the listing agent, you would want to confirm how compensation is going to flow. If you have not spoken with the listing agent, you're ready to make an offer, they have not returned your phone call, then yes, you would use the seller to buyer's brokerage agreement.
Okay, well, I was just going by what it says up here. To affirm what has been shared and allow the seller to confirm their commitment.
But the seller may have made the commitment to pay the listing brokerage.
Okay.
But at this point, since we don't know, we would go right to the seller for compensation.
Okay,
So if you say it's a for sale by owner and you get the seller to sign that agreement and you procure the buyer and you get them to sign the agreement.
Well, the buyer should already have signed an agreement with you if they've seen the home, even on a for sale by owner. And then when you negotiate with the for sale by owner, you would submit the seller to buyer's brokerage agreement.
So maybe you just need to charge 2% for off market or for sale by owners.
Well, I think what our policies will most likely reflect is that we are requesting and recommending that you always put 3% in the buyer's brokerage agreement. Because the agreement states that we cannot accept any more than is being compensated by the agreement.
Right.
No, by the
Right.
buyer
but
in
we
the
could,
agreement.
could accept less
Correct.
Hmm.
if the
Correct.
seller wasn't, if the buyer wasn't willing to make up the difference.
Well, I mean, well, that's the next piece of what we look at is if we recommend X, then what is the company willing to accept versus what is the agent? So you as agents understand what your flexibility is.
Okay.
So if your buyer has signed a buyer agency agreement with you, and they have only agreed to pay you, let's say 2%,
Correct?
you can't ask for any more of that than that from the seller?
Nope. This, you can only accept what you have agreed to be compensated by the buyer. So if in your example, the buyer brokerage agreement states 2% and the seller is offering 2.5%, you cannot accept 2.5%. You can only accept 2%. And that's why our recommendation is that it would be in everyone's best interest to identify 3%. And then well, once we know, I mean, once we have a parameters or guidelines set for buyer brokerage compensation, because now we have to look at listing compensation versus buyer brokerage compensation as 2 different pieces. Now, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but yes, the buyer would still be responsible for the differential if the seller is paying less.
What if they
If the
don't
seller-
have that money? What if they don't have the money to make up that difference?
Well, then they shouldn't be pledging to you that they would pay us.
Well, circumstances change, right? I'm just wondering, like,
If the buyer has, okay, so now you're getting to a question, can the buyer brokerage agreement be amended? Yes, it can be. However, what we have to acknowledge is that a buyer signing a buyer's brokerage agreement is signing a contract. And while the contract states that anything that's received by a third party, including the seller, will be credited to the buyer, the expectation needs to be that the seller is going to be paying 0. And if you've been reading Inman or if you've been reading RISMedia, there are many large brokerage CEOs that are recommending that sellers place 0 as compensation to the buyer's brokerage, and allow the seller and the buyer to negotiate the compensation through the contract.
say that one more time.
There are many large brokerages that are recommending that sellers offer 0 compensation to buyer's brokerage and allow the compensation to the buyer's brokerage to be negotiated through the contract.
What do you think about that?
I'm still on the fence on
Hmm.
it. So that's,
Okay,
yes. And
I think from a professional standards standpoint, we are in a very dangerous time between now and the 17th of August, because right now it is a violation of the Code of Ethics to go and ask for more than the seller is willing to pay, or to negotiate commission at all at right now. But I guess on the 17th of August, that's gonna go out the window. It's gonna be the wild, wild west around here.
well,
Yeah.
but if I understand the way the code is written, it's the brokerages negotiating the compensation, and this pushes the negotiation of the compensation to the buyer and seller, so removes us from that element. That the seller, I mean, the seller has always been able to negotiate the compensation with the listing brokerage prior to listing, during listing, at any point in time. And it's not a violation of the code of ethics. But if if the selling brokerage is trying to negotiate compensation to them through the contract, then correct. That would, I believe that would be an element of a violation of professional standards. Is that correct?
Mhm.
So in this case, I guess what the way that this is attempting to relieve that is to move the negotiation of the compensation
Wait
to
for
the buyer and seller through the compensation agreements and defining how and who, well, defining how the money will flow, I guess is a better way. So back to our little, I'm sorry, are we good?
I've got a question, but it's really not.
No, go, that's what we're here for.
Well. Let's say the seller signs a listing agreement
Uh-huh.
and agrees to pay 6% to the listing broker,
Correct,
and they have to determine in the listing agreement, we haven't seen the listing agreement yet, the future one. They have to determine what amount of that 6% would be paid to the selling agency.
Buyer's broker.
The buyer's broker. Because what would prevent a listing agent for saying, okay, Mr. Seller's gonna pay 6%, but I'm gonna only agree to cooperate 2% to a buyer's broker. Because, and that's why it's concerning to me that the seller doesn't sign these things.
Mhm.
They could keep the bulk of the commission for the listing side and not.
So my understanding of the way the listing agreement will work will be, this is what I as a seller am willing to pay the listing brokerage. Bam, that's it. That's it. Now, do you want to pay a buyer's brokerage, yes or no? And to what degree? And this could, I haven't seen it, but this could go back to what Leslie's saying is, could the buyer brokerage section of a listing agreement say, I, the seller, am willing to pay up to 3%?
Okay. So we
But
have to
the
wait
the
until-
listing broker couldn't keep the total. They could only keep what the seller agreed to pay them.
But that's 6%.
No, it'll be broken out.
It's broken, yeah, it's broken.
It'll be broken out like today, well, we don't know. But I anticipate that like today, when you look at a listing agreement, paragraph 8 is the total compensation and paragraph 9 is what they're paying the buyer brokerage. That won't be it won't be that way. It'll be, this is what we're paying to the listing brokerage, X amount of money. And this is what we would consider paying to the buyer's brokerage.
From.
Two
that-
separate, no, separate,
Okay.
completely separate.
So it wouldn't say 6 up here,
It
it
would
would
say
say
3
3 and.
Whatever they're willing to pay.
Whatever.
And then it would say the money will be paid through the brokerage, or the money will be paid directly to the buyer brokerage, or something like that. Bunch of checkboxes. That's what I get. This is what I'm picturing in my head.
Right,
Well,
And
if they're
it's-
used to 6% already, would it be ethical to
No.
say, you can't do,
No.
you can't say
No.
4% to us and 2% to buyer if they want to?
Well, if they want to do that, as long as you can't do total, but you
Yeah,
can, if you're saying that they're used to 6%, first of all, we can't say they're used to 6%. There's no standard.
no,
You're
There's
right.
absolutely no standard. Second, however the listing agreement, and there are enough storms in my brain to confuse anyone, so,
well, it's working.
but what I anticipate happening, or what I see happening is that there will be a paragraph that says, this is what I'm going to pay the listing brokerage, and this is what I'm going to pay the buyer's brokerage, or will consider paying the buyer's brokerage. Two completely separate elements. Nothing, one is not connected to the other. That light comes off. One is not connected to the other. So it'd be completely separate. So there's no discussion of a total amount. There's only the discussion of what's paid to the buyer's brokerage and what's paid to the listing.
Is that the wonky chair?
Just another
It's,
opportunity. to
it's okay.
share.
Okay,
So what if the agent does not send over a seller's broker to buyer's broker agreement? Well, we kind of have discussed this, but create a compensation agreement to send over with the offer, either the seller's broker to buyer broker, or if they haven't sent over a seller's broker to buyer brokerage, then just do a seller to buyer's brokerage. Memorialize whatever you believe or whatever the compensation is that the buyer is requesting from the seller to be paid to their brokerage. Remember, it's whatever the buyer is requesting of the seller to be paid to the buyer's brokerage. Okay. Which compensation agreement should be used? Okay, based on the conversation with the listing agent, the seller's broker to buyer's broker agreement should be included with the offer. If the listing agent in any way discusses or says the monies will be paid through the brokerage, otherwise assume that it comes directly from the seller. Right?
Okay.
So if you don't have confirmation from the listing brokerage, if you haven't been able to get a hold of the listing agent, if they haven't called you back and you're ready to submit your offer, don't ever not submit the offer. Use the seller to buyer's brokerage agreement and send that on over.
Okay.
That's the seller's commitment to pay the buyer's brokerage.
That we use that a lot.
Probably. And remember, in I think it's in the seller's brokerage to buyer brokerage agreement, talks about if there's a problem. So not mediation, but arbitration.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have to have that one signed or initial, excuse me. So that'll be. Yeah, because usually arbitration deals with compensation. So if there's an issue of the brokerage being compensated, we need to have that portion executed and initialed. Let's see, where are we? Could the seller to buyer's broker compensation agreement be used? And absolutely yes, since the listing agent didn't send over a previously executed agreement or may not have been clear on how the compensation would flow, you can use the seller to buyer's brokerage compensation agreement to affirm how the seller will pay the buyer's brokerage or the buyer brokerage. Right? So that's the seller is executing that, saying that this is what I'm paying to you. Again, it just shows up as debits and credits, but it's how the negotiation with the seller took place at the time of the listing could impact which party pays. All right. What if we were not able to get a hold of the listing agent? Not that you can or cannot. Then the seller to buyer's brokerage agreement would be the best agreement to include with the offer. A lot of this is redundant because you guys have been bringing up good questions. We've kind of been going over it, but those were my head was running when we were doing this. Can the seller alter the compensation expressed in the compensation agreement? Yes, the seller can go ahead and negotiate the compensation. So compensation is always negotiable. So a seller can alter the compensation being based on the terms and conditions that are being offered by the buyer through the buyer brokerage. This would be done using the modification form. So there's a modification to each form, but if the seller would like to alter the amount that is being offered or that is being requested, then they would use the modification agreement. If the seller has indicated they're willing to pay a certain amount and then at the time of negotiation is unwilling to pay that amount, it can be modified through the modification to the agreement. All right. All right. How do we deal with the difference in compensation from 2.5 to 3? So the buyer had agreed to 3%. The seller is willing to pay 2.5%. So the buyer can be charged the difference and pay it at closing. This would be reflected in your commission disbursement, and that would be sent over to the title company. So the buyer can be charged the difference. The buyer can pay the difference if they've agreed to a certain amount and it's more than what the seller is offering. The buyer can pay that difference.
We have to have that convo with them, right? So it's not like they're surprised.
Well, there shouldn't be a conversation. It shouldn't be a surprising conversation because they've executed the agreement at the onset of the tour, the onset of the relationship. So we've already agreed to a certain percentage. If at any point, and we've discussed creating a form for you that you can write in the address, you can write in the compensation, you can write in the difference. So that you can show it to the buyer. However, we have to be really careful of something like that, just because until we see kind of where things go, I don't know that we want something out there where you're showing what the difference is. And could you be eliminating properties? And it's probably going to have to initially it'll have to be a one-on-one basis where you have a discussion with your buyer and memorialize something in the buyer agency agreement, and then figure out how each property flows from there.
So going back to earlier, when we first started, in additional terms, in your buyer's consultation or buyer's agreement, it can be worded in there.
Sure, if
That
I
they will look at property and they will compensate if it's lower than,
well, that's already written into the agreement.
yeah,
The agreement says this is what I'm paying you as my buyer broker.
yeah,
You'll credit me anything that gets paid by a third party, if anything,
okay,
but otherwise I'm still responsible for this.
Yeah.
So what would things that would go in the additional terms would be things like buyer requests no properties under 2.5% compensation by seller be shown.
yeah.
But then again, we don't know what the negotiation will be once the buyer and seller start to negotiate terms. So could that be misleading? I don't know.
So would that be a rider situation or a modification situation?
I'm sorry, would what be?
That 2.5 instead of 3% with, say, you get a counter offer from a seller and the seller's saying 2.5 instead of 3 as their strategy in their negotiation.
Well,
So then
again, the
what?
buyer's already agreed to pay 3.
Okay,
So if the buyer says the example was that the buyer said and asked you to put into additional terms that they don't want to see anything where the seller is offering less than 2.5%,
okay,
knowing that they would get paid, they would get credited 2.5%, but they were comfortable still paying 0.5%.
okay.
So the question becomes, well, if it were the right house and the negotiation played out, and now the seller was only willing to pay 2%, would the buyer have been willing to pay the differential still? So we have to be very careful about putting limits on there. I mean, it's almost like, do you want to see things with compensation or do you not? I mean, it's
And basically, you just have to just show them a net sheet every time. You
Yeah.
just say, this is what you're up against. If you want to see this house,
Well,
this is how much it would be.
again, no, when you start doing that, we negate the element of the buyer brokerage agreement. So remember, there's a contract between the buyer brokerage and the buyer, where the
Right,
buyer has committed to pay the buyer brokerage a certain amount of money. It's the bottom line.
okay. The devil's in the details.
Just
Okay.
nobody cry.
So I mean, you guys,
Okay.
it's when the buyer brokerage agreement's executed, it's a contract.
Okay.
Are you entering into a contract and understanding? Yes, the understanding is whatever I put in this blank here is what I, the buyer, am willing to pay you. If I don't get any credit, I still have an obligation to pay you. Yes, ma'am.
No, I'm just trying to take it all in.
Okay. The buyer can request the seller pay the differential. So the offer would contain the seller's broker to buyer's broker compensation agreement for 2.5% and a seller to buyer's brokerage compensation agreement with the seller paying 0.5%.
We gotta just come with these on our showings. Once we find your house, we'll fill this out, and then we'll fill this out.
Well, I don't know if you need money showings, but I mean, when you're ready to write your offers,
Yeah,
you need to
yeah.
figure out how.
We'll fill-
We recommend including the compensation, the seller costs, and or additional terms.
So
Oh,
both
we can still
forms-
use additional terms to talk about compensation.
1 second. Additional terms in the purchase and sale agreement?
Mhm.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
In the purchase and sale agreement, not
oh yeah, not.
in anything related to
No,
MLS. Yes, ma'am.
So in that case, you would put both of these forms
With
with
an
an offer.
Correct.
This is what
Because,
you said you pay, but I want you to pay more.
So this is what you said you were paying
Mhm.
through the listing brokerage,
Right,
and we accept that. But we also
Okay.
want you to pay this.
okay.
So now you're negotiating directly with the seller on that additional compensation. And I know you all think I'm crazy and I'm probably
Yeah,
going into the
yeah.
weeds too far.
Real life is
That-
gonna get involved in
that-
this.
Yeah, so, but I did check this out.
Oh, I know,
I'm not
I
making-
believe, I
I'm
know.
not
I
making poopy
believe
up.
you. Yeah.
But so, but because of, so you would need both, if you want them to pay the difference. The buyer can request concessions equal to the amount that is owed to the buyer brokerage from the seller, and then pay the buyer brokerage at closing. So the buyer can say, I want concessions, and please note, concessions and compensation are different
Mhm.
and must be identified differently in your offer. This is going to throw us off a little bit because there is not a separate section for concessions versus compensation in MLS post-closing. So all those funds would fall under concessions. So when you're evaluating properties for against a subject property for a CMA for comps, then you're probably going to want to take into consideration the amount of concessions that we're offering. Again, so what are we doing here? Well, the buyer is asking for concessions equal to an amount that they would then be charged to pay the buyer brokerage at closing.
Do they have to disclose that that's what they wanna use it for?
No, they can just ask for concessions because the money that they get for concessions is going to their closing costs.
Right,
Oh,
then that will give them the money out of their pocket to pay, but pay
Bingo.
their broker.
Correct.
Buyer broker.
And then of course, the buyer brokerage can waive the differential. So just, we're working on that right now and hopefully by the end of the month, we'll have revised policies so that there's a couple of weeks between policies and August 17th, right?
Right.
So you'll see what the company guidelines are. Now, one more that's not up here that I am not recommending at this time is the buyer could increase the price of the property and request the seller to pay the compensation.
no, because of, yeah.
So
So sometimes attention.
that the buyer could increase the price on the property to cover the compensation that they're requesting the seller.
So you're not recommending that they do that, or at least
I mean-
not say that they're doing that.
In this market, I suppose, depending on the area, because obviously things are very micro market. So if you're in an area that is very competitive and it's seen, and pricing is at 99 to 101% of the asking price, and it may be reasonable to formulate your offer that way. We're in a market where the general market is averaging 94 to 96%, so we're in a more balanced market now. So doing that to raise the price could potentially throw off the appraisal.
Yeah, right.
So that's why we're not recommending that at this time. It's not on the list, even though we talked about it. If you throw me up against a wall, I'll deny it. Anyway, never said anything about it. Any additional scenarios or questions we want to throw out at this point?
I do have a question about when you are talking with your buyer and explaining how commission is divided between the seller and the buyer and having that conversation. What is the verbiage that we can use? Is like typically it's 6% and then it's split 3. I know. How do you?
You can't, I mean, there's your buyer brokerage consultation, your buyer consultation needs to focus solely on your buyer.
Okay.
That's what it has to focus on. Mr. and Ms. Buyer, Ms. Buyer, Mr. Buyer, you're hiring me to do a job.
Okay.
These are the things I'm doing.
Okay.
These are how I help you get from A to Z. This is what happens during this transaction. These are the things that we manage. These are the things that we'll work on together.
Okay,
My fee to do this is X. That's my fee. My fee to do this.
If they're a past customer, can you reference like the last time I listed your house, this is what we did, but it's changed now and this is how we're doing it?
I mean, sure, you can reference that. You can, I mean, I would think that in the discussion of you listing the property, there would probably be a discussion. So you're talking buyer, you're talking seller. With the sellers, we're gonna have to have the discussion. This is what I do, this is how I get paid, this is what it is, and this is my fee. And at that point, they may say, wait a minute, it was like more than that last time, wasn't it? Absolutely it was, but here's the next discussion we have to have. So previously, through that compensation to our listing brokerage, there was compensation assumed for the buyer's brokerage. Let's talk about that buyer's brokerage. Do you feel that it's important to have a buyer brokerage? Do you feel that it's important to incentivize a buyer's brokerage? Do you feel that it's necessary for a buyer brokerage come? Do you feel that you'll get more money? So you have the discussion about what a buyer's brokerage brings to the pie, brings to the party, and then what a seller is comfortable compensating the buyer brokerage, or at what level they're willing to compensate the buyer brokerage.
But then to flip that around, so if I'm working with a buyer and it's a second property I've helped them buy, can I still reference the way it used to be? The last time you bought something, the seller agreed to, but the environment has changed, or the rules have changed, and
Personally, I think it's to your detriment to do that. I think it's because now you're bringing in the other party, where if you focus on what you do and what you bring, what your role is in this, in helping them get from start to finish, then in the buyer brokerage agreement, you can state, now, while this is my fee, here's what I'm willing to do for you. I'm willing to accept, if a seller is offering compensation, I'm willing to accept that against what you owe, or I'm willing to work with you to enhance the terms and conditions so that the seller will compensate the buyer's brokerage. So I mean,
so
I think if the buyer,
just explain, this is how it is now.
I mean, I think,
2 days.
and if there are questions, then you have to address the questions,
Right.
you know. But at this point, I think it's probably best to focus on moving forward.
Okay.
You know, this
That makes
is
sense.
the seller and this is the buyer.
That makes
And
sense.
it's, you know, at some point, you know, you could have it, you might end up having a discussion where the buyer says, well, you know, why wasn't this what their seller was paying for? Well, actually, come on, let's think about it.
yeah.
How negotiable might they have been before, where you now hold the cards to negotiate potentially with them on all terms and conditions? Yes, ma'am.
On listed property, currently listed property. Do we need to bring new forms on the 17th of August and totally redo everything then?
We do not need to bring new forms to currently listed properties.
Perfect. But we have to.
But you're not gonna
have
like,
these
you're not
things.
gonna like the, you're not gonna like the other side of it. There will be an amendment to the listing agreement.
Good.
And so if we get a listing between now and August 17th, we should probably include all this,
Well,
unless we think it's gonna.
the compensation,
Before the 17th.
the compensation agreements are already in the listing packages and they're already in the buyer packages. Again, why do we do that? Because we don't know how people are going to be reacting on the other side, and I want you to have as much control as possible. Second, that's on the buyer. That's why it's in the buyer's package. Why it's in the listing package is you have to be prepared to have a discussion with your seller about how compensation flows. And if you're taking a listing now, and even though you may only have it on the market for a week and close in 30 days, you're still into that past August 17th date where there's going to have to be some memorialization of what the compensation is.
It would be amended anyway.
So,
We have to-
and everyone, and I know I'm preaching to the choir for everybody who's here, but in app files, we have created forms packages. We've tried to create as many forms packages as possible, both on the listing side and the sales side. And so it says listing package, it says sale and purchase package. please select those packages. They do have the most up-to-date forms in them. I know some of you are going, but when I select a package, all these forms come over and I don't need all the forms. I get it. You can always split them out. You can always just select the ones you need, but we're trying to prepare you. So if you select the forms package, all of the forms will come over. Like all these compensation forms are in both packages. So we're trying to help you through this transition time and into the craziness that's going to occur, that's occurring, in August and September. So the forms packages are really there to help facilitate the process. And if you find an error, like Brett found an error, and I appreciated him bringing it to our attention, we fixed the package. So
what I'm planning on doing, because I haven't dwelled on this because nobody has told me these are cast in stone yet. We've not gotten the final versions of these, but I'm going to go into app files and create an app file that says training for Linda. And I'm going to download these so I can print them out and look at them and all that. Is that going to be a problem for anybody?
just go right ahead. Create test files all day long you want. Just call it an agent test or something like that.
Okay.
Yes, Brett.
Couple things. Number one, how can we do the buyer's agreement to include any incentive that a builder is offering? So if the
Okay.
builder is offering 1% more commission, but we tap ourselves out at 3%, how can we grab that 1%?
So let me give you the recommended line, and then I'll give you the other option. So the recommended line is anything over what we've agreed to should be credited to the buyer. If it's not going to be done that way, then you would need to, at the time of execution of your buyer brokerage agreement, include it in your additional terms. For example, buyer agrees to allow buyer brokerage to accept compensation of up to 1% or $5,000 or up to $10,000 bonus being offered by third party.
Okay.
Something like that would be best. I will tell you though that with the amount of press that's out there on this stuff right now, you may get pushback from your buyers related to compensation over what they've agreed to pay.
Right. Okay. And then
we have been having.
And then secondly, it's nice to know that all of the agents were all in the same boat, and I'm hoping that other agents will be kind if there are errors, as we should also be kind to agents if they are accidentally making errors.
Yeah. I think it's a great motto, and I think we're going to have to share some kindness. Unfortunately, I've had multiple agents from our brokerage say that they've seen friends of theirs from other brokerages, and more than one of them have said that the agent had no idea that the forms were changing.
Yeah,
That's right.
it's true.
And that scares me a little bit. Okay, a lot. Anyway, all right. So thank you. Was there another question, Brett?
No, that's it.
Okay. And I'm just going to go back to Bonnie's secret for a second. Bonnie's hand's still up, but I'm guessing that you're okay with, oops.
Has to unmute. She's muted.
Yeah. Anyway, how about, Leanne? Go to Leanne then.
Hey, I have a quick question. Well, probably not quick because none of this is quick, but if there is no compensation agreement with the seller's brokerage to the buyer's brokerage, can a listing agent still say, hey, the seller may be willing, or is it just, nope, there's not one? And the second part to that question is if we as agents who are showing the property, can we get in trouble then if we have the agreement with our buyers that says buyers don't want to see any houses that are offering less than X% of commission, because then the seller can come back and say, wait, no, I was willing to negotiate directly with you, just not through my brokerage. That's gets
Right.
concerning for us getting in trouble.
So going to second question first, that's why when I said, you know, if they put into that something less than it's really needs to be a yes or no. I want to see properties that offer compensation, or I don't want to see properties that offer compensation. Again, could we get in trouble for that? Absolutely, we could get in trouble for that. I see all sorts of fair housing issues. I see all sorts of other issues coming up. But you're exactly correct, because if a seller is offering nothing, going back to your first question, can a buyer brokerage tell a buyer, look, the seller is saying they're not offering anything. Here's what I can tell you are options. You can still ask for something. We can submit a seller to buyer brokerage compensation agreement asking for some compensation to your buyer brokerage. That's one of your options. Two, you can ask for concessions towards your closing costs to offset what you pay to the buyer brokerage. So I think it becomes making sure that they're somewhat similar to what Maggie was saying, they're engaged in this negotiation, that they understand that they have options, and that there's a commitment that they've made to us as the buyer's brokerage, but that there are options still available to them, like still asking the seller to compensate through the seller to buyer brokerage compensation agreement, or offsetting compensation from the buyer to the buyer's brokerage through concessions that the seller would pay to the buyer or towards the buyer's closing costs.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
I'm getting a headache.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right. Thanks.
Clark, you're
Good question.
amazing.
Thank you.
You are
No.
amazing. I mean, you just
Didn't you-
explain so good and you just keep
Well,
going.
thanks, but
Yeah.
You
just
just keep
keep-
going. Your engine never stalls. I'm so impressed.
don't be, but thank you. All right, how about other things we want to throw out there? Online, guys. Y'all, we know that this is a lot.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but
the most important,
It is.
some of the most important things, including what Brett said about being kind to each other and being kind to the people on the other side, even though sometimes they frustrate you, is call me. Let's talk about it.
thank you.
Let's figure it out together. If the listing agent is not being responsive, do we need to call someone else? If
Mhm.
we're not getting, you know, if we're submitting our offers, great. Now remember, purchase and sale agreement and listing agreement are changing. Are the ones that we're currently using valid? Absolutely. Will they change? Definitely. Will they change again? Most likely.
Yeah.
Do they change every 2 to 3 years? Yes. So will the first change happen? Will they wait 2 years for the first change? Probably not. But anyway, so that's it. Let's
Okay.
see.
Thank you.
Ask to unmute. Yeah, I'm concerned that, can I unmute you, Bonnie, just in case you have a question that I missed? Oops, I go again. Putting things back
And
and
you
around.
click on ask to mute, unmute.
I can ask to unmute, but
Can
she has
you-
to unmute. So yeah.
Can you unmute her? Can you unmute her?
I tried, but I put her hand
Now
down,
she's
so
gone.
well, I put her hand down, so now she's gone.
Yeah.
Okay, I see Hazel.
There she
Hazel
is.
looks like she fell asleep. Okay, that's all right. I don't blame you, or you have a headache. I'm not sure.
Good.
There's Bonnie, there's Nick. Kathy, are you awake?
She's-
Kathy's
Great meeting.
crying.
Thank you, Clark.
Okay.
Thank you, Clark.
I'm here. I'm awake.
So what?
I'm
You're-
here.
I'm kidding.
I'm
My leader's
cleaning
here
off
with
my
me.
desk.
Oh, hey, Audrey.
Hi.
Hey, Audrey. Oops.
Hey,
Okay. it's like-
I'm ready.
turn
I'm
around.
to start.
I know you are. Huh?
Good to see you guys.
Hold on one second. Hold on one second. Here you go. Here you go. I think there's. Is it?
Thank you,
oh, no,
Clark.
are we? Okay. There we go.
Yeah.
There we go. There we go. Say hi to everybody here.
Oh,
Hi.
oh,
Spinning around. Spinning around. There's
oh, look
everybody.
at everybody.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Good to see
Okay,
you.
so I am going to stop the recording if everybody is good. And
We're good. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Clark.
all
Clark.
right, thank you
Thank
guys.
you.
Take care.
Bye, Hazel.
Bye.
So glad
Have a
Bye.
great afternoon.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.
you-
Bye-bye.
so good.
Bye.
So many things.